May 8, 1945. Trafalgar Square is a roaring sea of flags. Churchill stands on the balcony, cigar raised, soaking in the cheers of a nation that believes it has won. It has not. Inside the Treasury, a few hundred yards away, a memorandum is being typed. Its author is John Maynard Keynes. Its phrase will echo for 80 years. He calls Britain's position a financial Dunkirk. The war is over, the empire is bankrupt, and the country that armed her is about to send the bill. Britain had fought longer than any other Allied power. From September 1939 to August 1945, she had spent everything. Foreign reserves gone, overseas investments liquidated, £3 billion of them sold at fire sale prices to keep the convoys running. Gold shipped to Canada and South Africa to pay for rifles. The Treasury had run on a single instrument since 1941. It was called Lend-Lease, an American arrangement to supply Britain with arms, food and fuel on deferred terms. It was the artery keeping the war machine alive, and it was about to be severed. On August 21st, 1945, 6 days after Japan surrendered, President Truman cancelled Lend-Lease with a stroke of his pen. No grace period, no transition. The flow of American supplies stopped overnight, and Britain was presented with the outstanding balance. The cabinet read the telegram in silence. This channel exists to tell the financial stories that change how you see the world. If that sounds useful, subscribe, and we will keep going. Keynes was summoned. He was 52 years old, recovering from a heart attack, and he was the only man Britain trusted to walk into Washington and beg. He believed he was going to receive a gift, a grant, perhaps $5 billion free and clear as recognition of British sacrifice. He had drafted the arguments himself on the voyage across the Atlantic. Britain had stood alone in 1940. Britain had bled the Reich dry while America was still neutral. Britain deserved, in his elegant phrase, justice, not charity. He arrived in Washington in September 1945 with a leather briefcase, a failing heart, and the unshakable conviction that the Americans would understand. They did not. The negotiations began in the Treasury building on Pennsylvania Avenue. Across the table sat Fred Vinson, a Kentucky lawyer who had never read Keynes and did not intend to start. Beside him, an army of accountants. They listened politely to Keynes's appeals to history, to sacrifice, to the moral debt of the free world. Then they slid a document across the table, $3.75 billion, 2% interest, repayable over 50 years, and a list of conditions. Keynes read the conditions. The colour drained from his face. The first condition demanded sterling convertibility within 12 months. Any country holding pounds could demand dollars in exchange. The second condition dismantled imperial preference, the trade system that had bound the empire together since 1932. The third opened the sterling area, the closed financial bloc spanning a quarter of the planet, to American competition. Keynes understood instantly this was not a loan, it was a demolition contract. The Americans were not rescuing Britain, they were buying the wreckage at a discount with the rubble itself as collateral, and he had no power to refuse. He fought for 3 months. He filled notebooks with counter-proposals. He wrote letters to London at midnight, pleading for permission to walk away. London refused. There was no alternative. Without the loan, bread itself would be rationed by spring. He returned each morning to the Treasury building, climbing the steps slower than the day before. His doctor warned him. His wife begged him to come home. He stayed. By December, he was signing memoranda with a hand that trembled. The terms had not improved. They had hardened. The Americans knew exactly how desperate Britain was. On December 6, 1945, the Anglo-American Financial Agreement was signed in Washington. Keynes attended the ceremony in a dark suit, his face grey. He understood what he had done. He had borrowed dollars to repay dollars, mortgaged the empire to feed the country, and accepted convertibility terms that would, within 18 months, blow the pound apart. He sailed home on the Queen Elizabeth in a private cabin, working through the night on Treasury papers. In April 1946, 4 months after signing, he died of a heart attack at his Sussex farmhouse. He was 62. The country he left behind began its slow disintegration in plain sight. Bread, never rationed during the war, was rationed in July 1946. Potatoes followed. Meat rationing continued until 1954, 9 years after victory. Coal ran out in the winter of 1947 and London froze in the dark. The convertibility clause Keynes had warned against triggered on July 15, 1947. Within 5 weeks, holders of sterling cashed out so fast, the Bank of England suspended convertibility entirely. The loan was already spent, the empire was already shrinking. India left in August, Palestine collapsed in May. Then came Suez, October 1956. Britain, France and Israel invaded Egypt to seize the canal Nasser had nationalized. The military operation succeeded within days. The financial operation lasted hours. Speculators dumped sterling. The pound began to fall. Britain needed an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund to defend it. The IMF answered to Washington. Washington answered to one man. President Eisenhower picked up the telephone and called Prime Minister Anthony Eden. "Withdraw from Egypt," he said, "or we will not support the pound." There was no negotiation. There was no second call. Eden capitulated within 48 hours. British troops, victorious on the ground, were ordered to withdraw under American financial threat. The empire that had ruled a quarter of humanity for 3 centuries discovered, in a single phone call, that it no longer controlled its own currency. The Suez Crisis ended on November 6, 1956. The pound stabilized. The troops came home. And every chancellery in the world understood what had just happened. Britain was no longer a great power, she was a client. The checkbook had spoken, and the checkbook was American. The mechanism Keynes had foreseen in that Washington conference room had completed itself. The loan of 1945 was never about repayment in dollars. It was about repayment in sovereignty. Every clause, every condition, every percentage point of interest had been engineered to ensure that when Britain finally rose from the war, she would rise leashed. The Americans had not betrayed an ally. They had performed an acquisition. The instruments were not tanks or treaties. They were interest rates and convertibility schedules. Suez was not a humiliation. Suez was a foreclosure notice served 11 years after the contract was signed. The repayments continued for 61 years, through the devaluation of 1949, through the devaluation of 1967, through the IMF bailout of 1976, through Thatcher, through Blair. On December 29, 2006, the Treasury wired its final payment to Washington, £83 million. The cheque was signed by a junior minister most Britons had never heard of. There was no ceremony, there were no headlines. The war that had been celebrated in Trafalgar Square in 1945 was finally, quietly, paid off. Keynes had been dead for 60 years. The empire had been dead for 50. Wars are not won by armies. They are settled by creditors. The country holding the checkbook writes the peace, and the country signing the cheque writes the obituary of its own power. Britain learned this in a Washington conference room in 1945, taught by a dying economist who understood the lesson too well to survive it. Different empire, same warning. The next great power to mistake military victory for financial victory will discover, as Britain did, that the bill always arrives the morning after the parade. Was Keynes a hero who saved Britain, or the man who signed away her empire?